Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in sophomore English. We are in poetry collection number 3 of unit number 4, our poetry unit. And we are now going to take a look at Dylan Thomas's Do Not Go Gentle Into That Good Night on page 679. Now there's two ways to read this poem. I would write this down at 2B. There's two ways to read this poem. Some of my students are blown away by the message of this poem. It moves them in profound ways. By the way, put it in your notes at 3A. This is one of the few poems that we study that we will meet again in the senior year. This very poem is in the senior anthology by the same textbook company. But this poem is so important in the history of poetics that it finds its way back in the senior year. I think that when we're studying it in the senior year, we often have a greater tendency to look at its message power. Okay? But there's a second way to study this poem, and that's where we are, poetic forms. If you'll look really quickly on page 672, and I hope you are, 672, we are working in this poem. Do you see it there down below the Vilnali? Do you see it? Make sure that's written down at 2B. The Vilnali is a, first of all, 19-line offering. So start there. Not 14 lines, 19 lines. But it has a pattern of repeated lines and a specific rhyme scheme. A whole lot of poets have been very influenced by this form of poetry, and more particularly by the very poem that we will study. Dylan Thomas's Do Not Go Gentle Into That Good Night is probably the classic example of the novel. Let's take a look at what's going on. Make sure this is written at 2B. And then we're going to study it as we look at this poem from its form, poetic form side. The lines of a Vilnali are grouped into 5 3-line stanzas and 1 4-line stanza. The lines rhyme. Do you see this? A, B, A, B, A, B, I'm sorry, A, B, A, A, B, A, A, B, A, A, B, A, and then A, B, A to finish. Do you got me? So in other words, right away, if you want, you can flip in your book and see it. We're going to look at it in a second. But the first line rhymes with the third line, which also is the same A that rhymes with the fourth and the sixth line. Do you see it? Okay, so we're going to see this rhyming scheme thing happen. Notice also, number 2 about a Vilnali. Line 1, the very line, is repeated in full in line 6, 12, and 18. All right, the exact same line. Line 3 is repeated in lines 9, 15, and 19. Okay? So in other words, we're going to have a return, a repetition. This deliberate repetition can create a chanting effect, such as, I wake to sleep and take my waking slow, in the waking, for example, in a text we'll study. Or it can suggest intense passion, which we're going to see when we turn to Dylan Thomas's poem. Before we turn to the poem, let's go to page 675 quickly. Dylan Thomas, there your dates are, 1914 to 1953. By the way, we want to remind ourselves about the vocabulary in 674. Let's learn a couple of things about Dylan Thomas. Born in Wales, in Great Britain in the South, Dylan Thomas fell in love with words early in life. Poems poured out of him, and by the age of 20, he had written most of the poems for which he is famous today. So in other words, are you ready for this? By the time he was getting to be your age, Dylan Thomas was already writing some amazing poetry. There are some who believe that probably Thomas's most famous poem is Do Not Go Gentle Into That Good Night. Now, again, just to pay attention, you're going to see all the stuff we just listed for poetic forms. You're going to see repetition of certain lines. You're going to see the rhyme scheme, night, light, right, night. You see it? Okay, so we're going to see that kind of thing going on. I'm not really going to pay much attention to that now with you. I just want us to mess around with the poem in terms of its meaning. Let's say 3 things really quickly at level 1 to set us up. 1, the first thing I want to say about this poem is that it is a poem where the speaker, as a son, speaks to his father, who is soon to die. So that's the first thing. Okay, that's the first thing. This poem is very personal on that count. What is it like to be a child who has lived all your life with a parent, and then to watch that parent grow old and prepare to die? What do you want to say to that parent? Our speaker will have something to say, and it's right there in the title. Do not go gentle into that good night. Number 2. Like the Johnson offering, My City, that we just looked at, this poem will also treat the idea of death and dying, and more particularly, how you take the journey. Remembering again, jump to 3a, one more time. Remember again the power of the Odyssey and the idea that you take a journey into the underworld. If living is a journey, the Odyssey suggests, the Aeneid suggests, to some degree even the Iliad suggests, for sure Dante's Divine Comedy suggests, all these great epic poems suggest, if living is a journey, dying is also the beginning of another journey, the taking of a voyage somewhere. How do you prepare for that experience? How do you go through that experience? Very important to this poem. Finally, number 3. This poem has a very famous history in 303 because it is a poem about rebellion, about fighting. Write it down. And I remember vividly, as I like to tell my seniors this story, the afternoon that they walked in my room, the officials, the police, the principal, Dr. McGee, we need your help. I'm like, my help doing what? You'll understand once you come with us. I leave the building, we go across the meadow to the newly constructed superintendent's building, and there on the back brick wall, someone has taken spray paint and sprayed words on the wall. Rage. Rage against the dying of the light. End quote. And immediately, I found myself wanting to smile, but realizing that I shouldn't. Because immediately I recognized that those were lines coming from Dylan Thomas's classic, Do Not Go Gentle in That Good Night. When they asked me, I said, well, these are lines, famous lines from a famous poem. You teach this poem. A lot of most English teachers teach this poem. It's a very famous poem. Who put these words on the wall? And I said, somebody who obviously likes Dylan Thomas's Do Not Go Gentle Into That Good Night. Later in the day, the same lines were spray painted a number of places in our town, and it was pretty obvious that some single or number of these students who had studied this poem had decided this poem of rebellion needed to be shared in other venues as well. Let's study the poem now and enjoy the ways in which this is a poem about rebellion, as well as a poem about love, we might say as well. Let's enjoy. Here we go. Follow along closely. Allow this poem to move you. It's a pretty compelling one.
Do Not Go Gentle Into That Good Night by Dylan Thomas. Narrated by Dylan Thomas.
Do not go gentle into that good night. Old age should burn and rave at close of day. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. The wise men at their end know dark is right. Because their words had forked no lightning, they do not go gentle into that good night. Good men the last wave by, crying how bright their frail deeds might have danced in a green bay. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. Wild men who caught and sang the sun in flight, and learned too late they grieved it on its way. Do not go gentle into that good night. Grave men near death, who see with blinding sight, blind eyes could blaze like meteors and be gay. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. And you, my father, there on the sad height, curse, bless me now with your fierce tears, I pray. Do not go gentle into that good night. Rage, rage against the dying of the light.
Made even more compelling that we have a recording of Dylan Thomas reading this poem for us the great poet voice. Notice he takes it very seriously, doesn't he, this poem. All right, let's go through it quickly at level 1. Notice the poem begins with an observation. Do not go gentle into that good night. Old age should burn and rave at close of day. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. Pause and write it down at level 1. What is he saying in this poem? When it comes time to die, you have two options. One, you can kind of lay back and quietly, passively accept the fact that death is inevitable and coming. 3A observation, we can think about the classic story of Socrates in Plato's great dialogue, the Phaedo, P-H-A-E-D-O, where we're told about how Socrates jokes around about soon to die. He's about to drink the hemlock shake, the poison, and he lays back and he goes to sleep. He takes it all very philosophically. We have a second way to think about dying, and it is here. Rage. Rage against the dying of the light. Another, let's put in our notes. He's going to recommend there's another way to come to your end. Fight. Fight all the way. In other words, do not go to the van quietly, to use our word picture of how children at the park don't want to go. Don't you go to that van quietly. You go kicking and screaming. You make them drag you to the van. Why? Because, notice, inherent in this poem is this idea. Because living or swinging at the park, living in this world is so amazing. You shouldn't want to leave. You should live your life in such a way so that at every moment of it, you are so pleased to be a part of this thing called your life that you do not want to go when it comes time to leave. Notice the second grouping of 3 lines. We begin, did you see it? With a series of observations by different kinds of people. Do you see it? In the second stanza, just look at it with me. In the second stanza, it's wise men. In the third stanza, it's good men. In the fourth stanza, it's wild men. In the fifth stanza, it's grave men. And then finally, he speaks to his father. So at level 1, you want to write down each one of these. What is it that wise men have to say about dying? What is it that good men have to say about life? What is it that wild men have to say about life? Do you see it? So in other words, let's work through them quickly, and let's make sure we have some observation about each one of them. First of all, wise men. Wise men know dark is right, because their words had forked no lightning. In other words, wise men who have spent, we think Socrates, who have spent their whole life thinking philosophically about the coming of death, and yet when it comes, the moment of death finally comes, wise men are still ready to not go gentle. They're going to fight. Good men, the last wave by, crying how bright their frail deeds might have danced in a green bay. When it comes to the end, all the good things that a good person has done, still, it's not enough. They want a little bit more chance to live. We think of Scrooge when he sees that third ghost pointing at his tombstone, and he falls on his knees and starts begging for just one more chance of life, right? Wild men who caught and sang the sun in flight and learned too late they grieved it on its way. In other words, there are wild men who don't really kind of think about the beauty of this life, come to the end of their life, and then they're like, man, what have I done with my life? We have often said in 303, we all say the same words at the end of our life. Oh my God, the question is the inflection of the voice. A lot of times we'll come to the end and go, oh no, what have I done with my life? The next one, grave men. Grave here means serious. We're back kind of to the wise men, grave men, near death, who see with blinding sight. Blind eyes could blaze like meteors and be gay. Just one more second. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. And then finally, notice the poem becomes profoundly personal. For those of you that know the band U2, the lead singer and the writer of the songs, for most of the songs, his name is Bono, wrote a famous song for his dying father named Kite, K-I-T-E, that was motivated by the Dylan Thomas offering here. And if you're not familiar with this poem, with this song, Kite, I very much recommend that you take a look at it. Notice he speaks to his father. There, he says, on the sad height. Sad because, of course, his daddy's about to die. Curse, bless me now with your fierce tears. What an interesting adjective, fierce. Jot down at level 1, what does fierce mean to you? if you love fiercely, if you cry fiercely. In other words, he says to his father, when it comes time and we have to say goodbye to each other, I hope that your tears are fierce. Fighter, right? By the way, we're drawing on a very ancient tradition, in the biblical, Jewish especially, tradition of right before the father or the patriarch dies, he calls in all of his sons and he says for them the blessing. He gives them the blessing. And here he says, I want your fierce tears, I pray. And then one more time, do not go gentle into that good night. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. Let's jump to 2a really quickly. What's the major messages here that we're now going to see? Well, the obvious major message here is this idea that you have two choices when it comes time to die. One is to acquiesce, give up, and just go away. The other is to fight all the way to the end. In other words, a major message here is be a fighter, be a scrapper. We think of Shina Nai's poem, The Fist, right, from our earlier poetic study, as being that notion of you got to fight, you got to struggle all the way to the end. At 2b, we obviously pointed out that this is a Vilnali. It is true that rage against the dying of the light, and do not go gentle unto that good night, both are repeated. Jot down in your notes at 2b, what is the significance of that repetition? Some have said that it's like a bell gonging. It's like a chorus to a song that keeps coming back over and over again. At 3a, what does this poem most remind you of? We've already mentioned the great epic tradition of journeys into the afterlife and all of that. Do you have a poem that comes to mind? If you love the music that, at least in the past, was referenced as rap music, if you love that kind of music, what is a song that in any way plays the same similar kind of game? Repetition of certain lines or words over and over again with a certain kind of rhythm. Finally, at 2b, maybe a difficult question, but we're sophomores so we can ask it. When it comes time for them to go, who will you most miss in your life? That is to say, if you had to speak to someone older than you who is going to leave and take that journey of death, who is that person? And what would that be for you? What would you say to them? How would you speak to them? And finally, of course, at 3b, what is the best way to die? Is it to die peacefully, quietly, or is it to go kicking and screaming on your way to the van? What for you will be the way that you decide to go? Will it be gentle or not gentle into the good night? Well, there you go, a classic. We'll come back to it in our senior year. We'll study it again. Thank you.